Hey everyone, welcome into Fireside Chat for today. Today's topic is on the escalation of military conflict between the American colonies and the British. And here we are in 1775, and to reset the scene for tonight, remember, hitting the 1770s meant that violence was really starting to become a significant part of the protest era. You've got the Boston Massacre, the Gaspee Affair, the Boston Tea Party. The war seems like it's on the horizon, and the colonies look as if they're really at a point of no return, meaning there's not going to be any other option by the time we hit 1775 than to fight the British. And much as has been the case for the majority of the protest era, Massachusetts is going to be sort of in the driver's seat, at the front of the conflict. And that is really going to remain to be true as the bullets and cannonballs start flying in the spring and summer of 1775. So let's set the stage here. It's April of 1775, and the British have been sending more troops to the colonies, especially to Massachusetts, and a lot of this has to do with the coercive acts, or as the colonies called them, the intolerable acts. And in Massachusetts, there were more soldiers now than there were ever before in the colonies. Tensions were at an all-time high between Massachusetts and the British that were there. And ultimately, a rumor had spread pretty quickly that the Massachusetts military was going to start hunting and rounding up Sons of Liberty members, specifically Samuel Adams and John Hancock. So this rumor spread that the British Army was going to look to arrest these guys, and that set off a mass panic sort of amongst the colonies because both Adams and Hancock were great leaders of the protest movement. And this gives birth to one of the great sort of stories of the entire protest era and American Revolution era, and that's the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now, Revere, who we talked about with the Boston Massacre painting, Paul Revere was a devout patriot, meaning he was really involved in the Revolution and the protest era. He was well connected. I can't stress that enough. He knew people. He had allies all throughout the colonies. He was a big part of the committees of correspondence for Massachusetts, and he was a son of liberty. So Paul Revere was a guy who everybody knew. Paul Revere was a guy who everybody associated with the protest movement. And in April of 1775, as these rumors about the arrests of key Massachusetts leaders was getting out, Paul Revere took it upon himself to ride throughout various towns in Massachusetts, specifically in the Boston area, and Revere was passing along information about the impending British arrests of key colonial leaders. And so Revere's job was to get out and give information about the arrests and to warn people that the British Army was moving towards the cities of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And that was Paul Revere's big task. Now, Paul Revere has gone down historically as one of the great heroes of the American Revolution because of this ride, where he rode on horseback alerting people, the British are coming, the British are coming. Right? We've heard that before. He was even immortalized in a poem called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now, we're not going to read the poem, but what I find interesting about Paul Revere's story, a couple things. First of all, he got the information from a stable boy. A young boy about your guys' age, maybe a little older, was working as a spy against the British, and he passed Revere the information that he overheard. So really kind of a cool story about spying on the British. But furthermore, Revere was not the only person who set out on the evening that he did, the April evening that he did, to alert people about the British. There was another rider who we don't hear much about, and his name was Samuel Dawes. D-A-W-E-S, Samuel Dawes. Now, why do we not hear about Samuel Dawes? Well, the reality is Samuel Dawes was not as well connected as Paul Revere. he was respected, he was well known, but Revere, everybody knew who Paul Revere was. Everybody knew who Revere was. So when Revere started alerting people the British were coming, people took notice. Dawes was just less well known than Revere. He wasn't as associated with the revolution movement and the protest era. So when he came around, Samuel Dawes' alert wasn't as well received. It's not for lack of effort, because Dawes rode just as much as Revere and really tried to, again, warn people about the British Army's movements towards the cities of Lexington, the towns of Lexington and Concord. It just happens to be that Revere was successful, and Dawes' alert wasn't quite as well received. But it is a good thing that Revere got news out, because what happened as a result of Paul Revere's ride, Massachusetts militia were able to gather their forces, and these militia were nicknamed Minutemen because they had to be ready at any minute's notice. And so they gathered their forces and they went to defend various parts of Lexington and Concord. And as a result of the Minutemen, the colonists were well prepared for when the British did launch an attack on the towns of Lexington and Concord. Now, the small battles that would take place in Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, nobody knows for sure who fired the first shot. But the shots became known as the shots heard round the world, because this is really where the relationship between the British and the colonists have reached that point of no return for many. Once bullets start flying and cannons start shooting off, and people are dying now in combat, the Massachusetts militia fought the British at the battles of Lexington and Concord, and these are the first two battles of the war. But what people tend to forget is that at this stage in the Revolution in 1775, the war was primarily a Massachusetts conflict. It did not involve all the colonies. It would take the Second Continental Congress to really bring all the colonies together and to brace for war. So right now we've got this sort of engagement between Massachusetts and the British. And that would ultimately lead to a really significant battle in the summer of 1775 called the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that led to over 1,000 British casualties. Really a big loss for the British. And if there's one thing we can take away from the military fighting in 1775, it's the fact that the British were not able to conquer Boston. They tried to capture the city of Boston, but the Patriots who fought there held on to that city tooth and nail. They did not give in. And although they lost a lot of lives, the Patriots were able to defend the city of Boston at all costs. And that was crucial, because had Boston fallen so early in the war, things, could have taken a different turn. But the Patriots defended Boston. They were able to reinforce Boston with troops that were sent by the Continental Army. And so Boston was able to stay protected early in the war, and that meant that New England could continue its protest and continue the fight against the British. Now, okay, so this is a Massachusetts-only conflict, right? Other colonies are not getting as involved, and that was definitely true in 1775. There weren't a bunch of other fights going on in 1775 outside of Massachusetts. However, that does not mean that there weren't other sorts of conflicts that did emerge. And what I want to sort of talk about right now, I'm going to back things up. I'm going to back things up, and I'm going to go back and cover just a couple of events that do demonstrate violence did happen outside of Massachusetts before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. One example of that is an episode known as the Paxton Boys attack, Paxton, the Paxton Boys. Now, these were groups of Pennsylvania farmers. They were non-Quakers who led a lot of attacks on Native Americans in Pennsylvania before the Revolutionary War. The Paxton Boys were violent attacks. Think of it sort of like Bacon's Rebellion, in the sense that Bacon's Rebellion was all about Virginians that were fighting natives on the frontier. The Paxton Boys was a similar episode. And it's very similar to Bacon's Rebellion, in which these farmers, these Pennsylvania farmers living on the frontier, were attacking natives. The local Pennsylvania royal governor, who was sent, of course, from England, didn't like what the Paxton Boys were doing, and so the Paxton Boys actually marched and threatened to attack the Pennsylvania government. So it's a very similar episode to Bacon's Rebellion. And this, again, came before the Revolutionary War broke out. So long before Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, you've got conflict between the British government in Pennsylvania and local farmers in Pennsylvania. Another great example of a very similar episode was a situation in North Carolina. And this was known as the Regulator Movement. The Regulator Movement was a bunch of tobacco farmers violently protesting and fighting against the British government in North Carolina. There was great tension between the British government there and these North Carolina farmers. And not only does that sort of, again, much like Bacon's Rebellion, much like the Paxton Boys, showcase this idea that farmers were up against the local government. That tension between the frontier people, the sort of the backcountry farmers, and the local government. Very similar to Bacon's Rebellion, very similar to the Paxton Boys uprising, and very similar to the Regulator Movement. What these all sort of, these two examples I bring up, while they don't fit the sort of theme of the protest era, there were conflicts that emerged outside of Massachusetts. But see, that's one of the things that's so complex about what we're dealing with here. As the colonies were bracing for war, each colony sort of had its own problem. Right? The Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, the Regulator Movement in North Carolina, of course, Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill in Massachusetts. The problem that we're going to discuss tomorrow is that in getting ready for war, the colonists had the issue, and here's the key word of the day, of regionalization. Regionalization. Sorry, I stumbled over my words. Regionalization. Everybody had their own problems. And whether it was Native Americans, local governments, the British government, the colonies had very regional problems. And as the war is about to sort of take off in 1776, and mind you, we haven't even talked about independence yet. We haven't talked about Declaration of Independence. We haven't talked about breaking away from Britain. Right now, we're simply talking about regional problems. So Massachusetts had their regional problems in 1775. North Carolina had their regional problems with the Regulators. Pennsylvania had their regional problems with the Paxton Boys. These are all examples of regional problems, and that is going to make fighting a war against the biggest, baddest, best army in the world, aka the British military, extremely treacherous for the colonists. So that's what I'm going to leave you guys off with. Regional problems are going to make fighting a war against the British awfully difficult. But we know the colonies will prevail. And we know that the colonists are going to win the war outright. So our job over the next couple of days is to piece together how in the world could these colonies that had so many problems, so many regional issues, how could they end up beating the best army in the world? We need to make sure we clear that up and investigate that this week. So what we'll talk about tomorrow is how this begins to become possible. We'll talk about the Second Continental Congress, how they prepared the colonies for war, and how they got everybody organized as one colony sort of to fight. And then we'll talk about the steps that led up to revolution. Okay, we'll talk about the steps that led up to revolution. And by that we mean, of course, the Declaration of Independence. So that's what's coming down the road here the next couple of days. I wish you guys have a great evening, a great Tuesday evening. Remember, as always, the past shapes the future. Take care, everybody.